Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Zenaida Gould, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute. Tonight, we are honored to welcome Dr. Mike Amezcua, Assistant Professor of History at Georgetown University, to discuss his new book, Making Mexican Chicago. Welcome, Mike.
Hey, Sarah. It's so great to be here with you. And let me also officially thank you, Dr. Sarah Zenaida Gould and the Mexican American Civil Rights Institute for having me today. It's a real honor to be here. I've logged on for some of your terrific programming and have learned so much from the previous speakers. And so it's a real delight to be able to join you all in a little bit of a dialogue and talk about my book. Um, Let me check my slides here and make sure that everything is working. So if you allow me just a moment to let you know how I came to this project. And again, I feel really lucky to be able to talk to you today about my book, Making Mexican Chicago. I came to this project um, not from Chicago or being a Chicagoan, but really from my time as a youth growing up in Los Angeles, California. I grew up in South Central LA with immigrant parents from Mexico. My mother would tell me stories about her own family and her own mother, my grandmother, Ofelia, and how Ofelia was born in Chicago. This was a strange thing for me to hear because, well, one, my mom was an immigrant from Michoacan, and here she was telling me that her mom was essentially an American citizen. And and the second point is I had no sense of Chicago demographically or spatially. Chicago seemed so far away from LA, but also from Mexico. Um, but the point of my mom's story was that my grandmother, pictured here, holding my mother, was born in Chicago while her parents, immigrants from Zamora, Michoacan, were working there. Ofelia's father was a traquero, a railroad worker. And this was around the early 1930s, so right around the Great Depression, which, along with it being the worst economic collapse in the industrialized world, unleashed an intense campaign of state violence upon Mexican people who were then rounded up, deported, or repatriated to Mexico as they were blamed by this government's failures, the failures of Wall Street, which allowed the speculation of profits and value to go unchecked until it finally came crashing down. An estimated 345,000 people of Mexican ancestry were removed from the nation between 1930 and 1935. This included many children born in the United States, and this included my grandmother, who was deported along with her parents to Michoacan, and she never returned to the US, spending the rest of her life in Mexico. My mother told this story with a bit of irony, as she herself was an undocumented immigrant living, working, and raising her own family in Los Angeles, fully aware that her mother was a US citizen, but unable to claim that citizenship as her own. And these stories stayed with me. They shaped me as I thought not only about Chicago as a site of Mexican immigration, but the kind of inheritance that was handed to my mother in the form of generational precarity, rooted not only in urban inequality, but in hostile immigration control policies that had real material consequences for Latino communities in the United States. The removal of my grandmother from the nation state in the 1930s turned my own mother into an undocumented immigrant a generation later. And it conditioned our lives in particular ways. Um, and so, like so many scholars, especially first generation scholars, all of these family histories are never fully captured in our history books. And so I turned a personal family history into an intellectual commitment, whereby I eventually set out to write a history of the city that my grandmother would have lived in, would have inherited had she never been deported. But from the starting point of that precarity caused by a regime of immigration control that was placed upon Mexican people and Mexican people's bodies in urban spaces, a kind of racialized experience that would come to shape and condition the fight for community and permanence for Mexican Chicagoans, uh, arguably a fight that continues today. And so my book, Making Mexican Chicago, shows how the Windy City became a major Mexican metropolis during the second half of the 20th century. This demographic growth was fueled by the pull of American cities, propelled by the industrial and post-industrial economies of Chicago. uh, for those not familiar, Chicago was a kind of center point for steel plants and steel production, for meat packing and the slaughtering of animals for food consumption, and also was a railroad hub. It connected a lot of the North American railroad lines in Chicago, and so these industries initially attracted many immigrants, but also Mexican immigrants, and really set the ground for the first waves of Mexican immigration in the 1910s and 20s. Um, Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans took residence. Oh, sorry, I think I'm getting some feedback here or something. One second.
Okay. Okay, no problem. But thank you.
Yep, you can hear me, right, Sarah?
I can hear you. Yeah, you're good.
Okay, great. Okay, my bad. Um, they took residence in some of the most disinvested neighborhoods in the city, and mostly in the in between areas between white Chicagoans that kept the color line against black Chicagoans. Keep in mind, Chicago uh, has often been defined and it is a segregated city, but it's often been defined along this kind of binary of kind of black and white. Therefore, Mexicans occupied what I call the unstable vacancies of white flight, the areas that ethnic white families lived in or formerly lived in, or eventually left in the wake of unwanted demographic diversity. In my book, I argue that Mexican community formation and placemaking were constantly shaped by the crucible of demolition, which I'll explain, and deportation, which I will also explain, that followed migrant brown bodies, and that these twin projects contributed to a larger systemic form of spatial containment, the production and placement of inequality, and the politics and struggle for an equitable infrastructure. I also show how a distinct form of Latinx segregation was invented in Chicago, not through law, but as a very localized, malleable social policy practiced by local stakeholders that ranged from city officials, political leaders, the real estate industry, all the way down to local business groups, churches, neighborhood groups, and local community leaders. Today, I'll talk about two case studies in my book to illustrate this interplay between placemaking, the politics and struggle for an equitable infrastructure, and the structural forces of urban inequality that confronted Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans in particular ways. The first case is about the near West Side. This is an area that is right west, directly west of the downtown loop of Chicago. This was an area by the 1940s and 50s had a very large settlement of Mexican people, that would eventually kind of dwarf the original settlements. The original settlement being South Chicago, which is not on this map. Um, the second case I'll talk about is Pilsen in the 1960s and 70s, and that's a neighborhood just directly south of the near West Side, a vibrant Mexican neighborhood and an epicenter of the greater Latino Midwest that has faced different cycles of gentrification. Um,
Mike, I don't mean to
yep,
interrupt. I'm
yep,
sorry.
yep.
We're still looking at the photo of your grandmother, and
Oh,
you referenced
really?
a map.
Oh, yeah, I did reference a map. Let me click on this again.
It's okay. Yeah,
Can you see the map now?
I still see your grandmother, but it might just take a second for it to
Hmm.
hit over
Uh-huh.
here.
I apologize for that.
That's okay.
Let me leave it on the map slide and see if it'll eventually
Okay,
catch up.
no problem.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Okay.
I
But
didn't mean to interrupt. Yeah.
no, no, no. You're fine. I appreciate you told me. Um, so you can't see the map, but I hopefully it'll load and I'll talk a little bit more about it. Next to the map is a photo of the near West Side in the 1950s, very much in rubble, meaning that this was a neighborhood that was selected by the city and by state officials to um, enact what was called the urban renewal clearance or urban renewal program. This was a federal program that offered uh, uh, tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes almost millions of dollars, to redevelop urban areas. And this was happening nationally. This happened in San Antonio, absolutely. This happened in New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. And part of what my book talks about is really the arrival of urban renewal in this community at the same time that it's experiencing what's going to be an episode of heightened immigration control, culminating in the mass deportation known as Operation Wetback. And I want to just briefly uh, paint a picture of what was going on before those two things happened in the near West Side. The near West Side was a community that was, like I said, increasingly being Mexicanized. Many Mexican immigrants were finding the near West Side as a kind of port of entry neighborhood. It had already a couple of generations of Mexican American families living there. And in 1953, a meeting was held in Whole House, which was a settlement house in the community, and this meeting was hosted by a group called the Mexican American Council of Chicago. This was a civil rights and social service agency. And let me just pause really quickly to ask Sarah if the map has now appeared.
I'm afraid it has not.
Oh my goodness. Okay. Let me
Um,
then
do you want to maybe close
stop
your
sharing.
PowerPoint and reopen it? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay.
do that. I'm going to stop sharing. And I apologize for that. And then I'm going to go ahead
It's
and
okay. We're all used to technical hiccups at this
oh,
point.
absolutely. Yes, indeed. And you're all getting a sense of what my classrooms are like sometimes when Professor Amezcua gets things wrong and goofs up. So um, let me do this one more time. Let me allow that. And so, are we seeing a map now?
We are seeing a map. Yeah.
Yay!
Okay.
Fantastic. So,
Okay.
okay, fantastic. So if you look at the area shaded as the near west side, that's the neighborhood I'm talking about. This is the neighborhood in which a community gathering is being held in 1953. And what they're there to talk about are two things that are of critical importance to the neighborhood. One is the urban renewal development that's about to be taken up by the city. There are people from the city, there are people from the Department of Urban Renewal, uh, and they want to talk to the community about the future of this neighborhood. The second item on the agenda is a discussion of a new immigration law, which was passed in 1952, called the McCarran-Walter Act. And this law greatly limited most immigrant residents' right to live in the United States. It actually targeted those with ties to labor organizing for possible deportation if they were found to be immigrants or perhaps even undocumented immigrants. And keep in mind, Chicago in the 1930s and 40s was an important site for labor organizing, of which many Mexican immigrants partook in. So this law would have really made it much easier to arrest them, to deport them. And so demolition and deportation, these two issues really threatened the livelihoods of this community and of their beloved commercial corridor known as Halsted Street, which was the center of public life and the economic anchor for Mexicans in Chicago. Um, Eventually, by 1963, so 10 years later, this whole area would be bulldozed. It would be demolished, and the commercial corridor I just named would be erased from this community. Hull House, the place where the meeting was taking place, would also be bulldozed, and the entire Mexican Near West Side would be raised in order to make way for a new university, the University of Illinois at Chicago. But that's in 1963. In 1953, none of that was on the minds of people. In fact, people felt like urban renewal was an opportunity to plan the future of this community, perhaps to get some improved housing. And so Mexican Near West Siders engaged city officials in the redevelopment schemes of the city because they felt that this would potentially engage them as neighbors, as homeowners, as storekeepers and business owners, and otherwise empowering them with a sense of belonging, rather than the kind of um, the kind of stigmas that were being used by the McCarran-Walter Act that talked about Mexican immigrants as foreign aliens, as people that were subversive, perhaps dangerous to the nation state. Somebody that thought about these two things was a woman named Anita Villarreal, and this is her here in front of one of her apartment buildings, next to behind her a couple of Mexican immigrant workers, and right in front of her is her young son Daniel. Um, Anita was a Mexican American businesswoman. She was a civic activist. She was an influential spokesperson for the neighborhood. And she was somebody who played a critical role in the housing advocacy of Mexican people. And by participating in the reform efforts of urban renewal, people like Anita and others were hopeful that they could counteract the stigma, again, that was being associated with Mexican immigration at the time, and that instead she would have a say in the future of the Near West Side, of the businesses, of the community institutions that had long been built there. In the background, again, was this kind of redevelopment agenda by the city, like many other cities in America at the time, seeking to monetize and profit from slum clearance. And it's important to note that slum clearance at this time was really weaponized by city officials to really help control the kind of diversity and demographic diversity happening in urban America, in particular with respect to African American demographic growth during the height of the Great Migration and the Second Great Migration. So cities like Chicago used urban renewal money to kind of shape and reinforce a kind of Jim Crow landscape in the city of Chicago um, that would manifest into public housing towers that were created for poor and working class Black people. And it would also be ways to build expressways or freeways to really reinforce the segregation that existed between white Chicago and Black Chicago. This also affected communities like the Near West Side because the Near West Side, from the perspective of city officials, was that it was a slum, that it was something that ought to be bulldozed, that it had a settlement of mixed race and mixed ethnicity, and that was seen as kind of undesirable, and that rather investing in these communities, it'd be better to bulldoze them and to revitalize them. That was a word that was in operation by these city officials, and to make them much more profitable in terms of tax producing real estate. Now, just to paint a picture of the Near West Side in the 1950s, this was a community of Mexican home ownership. This is a couple of images of a building owned by the Guerrero family in the Near West Side. They were able to purchase this two flat brick building, which was in excellent shape, as you can see from these photos. They bought this in the 1940s. They sent many of their children off to war during World War II and during the Korean War. Many the family grew bigger during the 1940s and 1950s, and so the image on the right shows one of the Guerrero women with her baby. And these were the homes that were valued and cherished by Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans, but also homes that were within the target of bulldozing by city officials. This community was home to lots of businesses and forms of cultural production. This was on the left here. You see, and Sarah, do you see an image here of a magazine called Vida Latina?
Yes.
Fantastic. Vida Latina was a magazine that emerged out of this community that talked not only about Mexican life in Chicago, but Puerto Rican life. This was a mixed ethnic community that had Puerto Ricanos as well. So Vida Latina spoke to, in a bilingual way, the kind of life, pageants, bailes in the community. On the right here, you've got a carniceria, Casa Cardenas. This is an image from the 1950s of a very successful entrepreneur by the name of Bernardo Cardenas, who not only had a carniceria but had a furniture store, and eventually gets involved in politics in the city. And the Mexican Near West Side was a place of many other migrants from the Southwest, Tejanos, for instance. And this is an image of just a kind of like a flyer, a volante of a store called the 12th Street Store. This was a store that sold clothing, but also records, and it often promoted. This is a promotion for Pedro Infante and for all of the music that he made. So he was not only, of course, a movie star, but he was also a performer. And the 12th Street Store in Chicago was a place where you could buy Pedro Infante's music. On the far right, you've got an album by Amadeo Flores, a famous conjunto musician from Texas, who frequently toured along with other Tejano conjunto artists to Chicago to perform conjunto music. Amadeo Flores is notable for having a song called Skokie. Skokie was a suburb in Chicagoland, and it was a place that had a lot of Mexican workers that lived in railroad boxcars. And so the music really spoke to people in Chicago, in particular to many of the Tejano transplants that lived and worked in Chicago. And so the Near West Side was important for all of those reasons. Now, where again, this was a vibrant neighborhood, but this was also a community that was experiencing the uncertainties of urban renewal. And so by 1954, the merchants along Halsted Street formed the very first Mexican Chamber of Commerce in the city to protect their interests. They also were concerned about the federal escalation of what would become the mass deportation campaign known as Operation Wetback. This was a community that was under siege by federal agents. And if you know anything about Operation Wetback, you know that this was a federally mandated campaign directed by the Immigration and Naturalization Service. It began on the West Coast in places like Los Angeles. It moved its way through the Southwest. And around September of 1954, it arrived to Chicago. In Chicago, however, given its distance from the US-Mexico border, Operation Wetback utilized airplanes that had been decommissioned after World War II, planes such as this one, a C-46 plane, to fly hundreds of Mexican undocumented immigrants from Midway Airport in Chicago to Laredo, Texas, and then by train into the interior of Mexico. And, many of the factories that were no longer being utilized in Chicago during this time, such as the Studebaker Car Company factory, which was located on the southwest side of the city. This was used to cage Mexican people and Mexican immigrants, especially those suspected of being in Chicago without papers. And again, these were folks that would be caged in this factory and then transported to Midway Airport and then flown out of Chicago to Mexico. So people, of course, in the community were alarmed by this. They were alarmed by the by just the siege climate that had been created in the Near West Side. Critics of these deportation campaigns called the use of the Studebaker car plant concentration camps estilo Hitler. One other activist by the name of Harriet Barron wrote, quote, "Deportations are worse than prison. It means the destruction of homes and families. The campaign to extract undocumented workers from urban neighborhoods in the Near West Side had consequences beyond the removal of undesirable immigrants. Operation Wetback and its ideological apparatus diminished the political power of area residents, of civic agencies and organizations that fought against the deportations, because these campaigns helped to reinforce a link that in a community like the Near West Side, in the slums, indeed, was where Mexican undocumented workers hid. This was the idea that the INS agents exploited and weaponized. And so this community was under siege, and it harmed local businesses. It suppressed Latino public life. It criminalized people living in this community. In this context, Mexican residents insisted on staking a claim in their neighborhood's future by participating in the committees for urban renewal, like I mentioned before. And this is where I'll bring in Anita Villarreal one more time, because this was a person that she was a real estate agent. She was one of the first, perhaps one of the first Latina real estate agents in Chicago in the 1950s. And she was somebody that was red baited, meaning that she was accused of being a communist because a lot of her compadres were Mexican immigrant workers, people who participated in labor organizing. And she was accused of being somebody that was a defender of folks that were breaking the law, essentially. Now, she herself was not an immigrant. She was born in Kansas, raised in Chicago. She was a Mexican American, but she was a ferocious defender of Mexican immigrant workers. And along with being an owner of a real estate agency, she was also a public notary. And because of that, she handled immigration paperwork. She knew a lot of people in the community, and it really made her speak with some authority about the community to city agencies. But given that she was being red baited by federal officials, and in fact, by 1957, Anita herself was arrested by federal agents. She was charged with participating in an illicit economy that recruited and harbored undocumented workers. And this was a charge that she ended up pleading guilty to. So um, in pleading guilty, she fundamentally lost her standing in the meetings for urban renewal with city agencies. And so uh, by the early 1960s, so by 1960, 61, the Mexican Near West Side was on the verge of getting bulldozed. The mayor of Chicago handed over a big chunk of the land to the University of Illinois, and the university was essentially built on top of the former Mexican Near West Side. People like Anita lost her home. She was a mother of 6 children, so she had a large family, and they were displaced along with thousands of Mexican people, and they had to remake their communities in other neighborhoods that were hostile to the arrival of Mexican immigrants, but neighborhoods that were also experiencing white flight. The mayor's decision to bulldoze the Near West Side essentially achieved what downtown business elites desired all along, which was to raise the property values and replace the population that existed there with higher income residents. Now, let me fast forward to the case study of Pilsen. This is a community that is quite visibly Mexican. It's a neighborhood you can visit today, although it is indeed experiencing a new bout of gentrification. But I want to talk about the early fight of gentrification with this community. Now, keep in mind, I just talked about the Near West Side and how that community was essentially displaced by urban renewal. As Mexican residents are in search of new housing, it becomes an opportunity by the real estate industry, in particular by real estate agents in these neighborhoods, to begin to sell homes and rent apartments to Mexican immigrants. This would have included Anita Villarreal, who seized this opportunity to help Mexican immigrants find housing in this neighborhood that was primarily Eastern European or Czechoslovakian, Polish. It also had some Italian immigrants. And this was a community that was named Pilsen after the Czechoslovakian community named it so after a city in the Czech Republic. Um, Mexicans began moving into this neighborhood in small numbers in the 1940s, and then again during the era of urban renewal in large numbers by the 1950s, and in even greater numbers by the 1960s. And by the 1960s, this former Bohemian working class barrio becomes a Mexican barrio. And with increased Mexican immigration in the 1960s, it becomes a sanctuary for people from Michoacan, from Guanajuato, from Jalisco, from San Luis Potosí, from all places in Mexico, really, by the 1960s. And people take to it because this is a place where you could, you have your taquerias, you have your panaderias, you got signs in Spanish familiar foods, even if the architecture and the built environment in and of itself was not very familiar. This is an image of a Mexican Independence Day parade in Pilsen in 1969. If you look on the sides of the if you look at the buildings themselves, you get a sense of the architecture of this community, which is quite uh, unique if you're not familiar with Chicago, but very Chicago if you've been there before and you know it well. These are buildings that were many of them were built in the 19th century and are still very sturdy and very functional today. But at the time that Mexican residents are moving into a community like Pilsen and communities on the southwest side that still have sizable white ethnic populations, what I show in the book is that these white ethnic populations don't just hand over the community. They don't just give up their parishes, their schools, their business uh, storefronts. What I try to show in the book is that the transition of these communities from white to Mexican is a battleground. These are fights that happen. And this image shows white residents in Pilsen seeking to rezone the community in ways that would be favorable to them and to really stop the kind of demographic diversity that they're trying to prevent. And I spend a lot of time showing how this manifests itself kind of block by block to really get away from this idea that there's a kind of natural succession to demographic growth or community transformation, and that instead I wanted to show the campaigns, the campaigns by white uh, residents who are not only fighting the arrival of African Americans, but they're fighting the arrival of Latinos as well. Pilsen by the 1960s and by the 1970s is a critical site for the emergence of the Chicana and Chicano movement. Um, this is a community that um, is one of the few of other neighborhoods in Mexican Chicago that visibly becomes adorned by murals, by colorful aesthetics that are associated with the liberation politics of the Chicano movement. This is an image here of one of those muralists by the name of Ray Patlan, who is adorning an old settlement house, which was called the Howell Settlement House. And they liberated in the late 1960s, early 1970s, and they rename it Casa Aslan. And they paint colorful murals and images of Zapata, of Benito Juarez, of Mesoamerican icons. And this really becomes a mecca, if you will, of the Chicano movement, and of a kind of oppositional politics that will emerge in this community that will coalesce with what we historians call the community control movement. The community control movement was literally the fight to control the assets of a community, whether those assets were buildings or schools, or to have a say in bilingual education. And Pilsen really becomes the kind of crown jewel neighborhood for those kinds of politics. It's important to keep in mind that Chicago, politically speaking, is really controlled uh, by a really top down, city hall centered type of politics, controlled mostly by the mayor, a very powerful mayor at this time by the name of Richard J. Daley. This was a man who operated very much in the style of previous mayors, which was to control all aspects of your city, meaning that you told the city council how to vote. You named the appointments to the board of education. You controlled the patronage, the city jobs, and you did it for votes for support of the local Democratic Party. And so Pilsen becomes antagonistic and adversarial to what is a very neglectful machine apparatus. Um, and so Pilsen in the 1960s and 70s really uh, is a kind of in a moment of a renaissance to build a new community organizations, new social service agencies, free clinics, daycare centers, things that the city failed to provide this neighborhood. It becomes a vital cultural and political neighborhood. It is also a site of entrepreneurialism. This is a city that this is the neighborhood that produces the kinds of food and ingredients that will supply other Mexican colonias across the Midwest. And what I mean by that is literally like salsas, chiles, tortillas. If you're buying these things in Michigan, chances are they came from Chicago. If you're finding them in Wisconsin, chances are they're made in Pilsen. And so through placemaking, through cultural labor, through political autonomy, Mexican Pilsen develops a strong anchor for a community pride. But again, it's really being cut off by public city resources. It doesn't have access to public sector jobs. It doesn't have political representation in the local Democratic Party, and it's neglected in terms of its educational and recreational resources for children. But Pilsen enters an age of gentrification during these years. And it's something that's really baked into the disinvestment of the community. And what I mean by that is that initially in the urban renewal era, when Mexican immigrants are searching for new neighborhoods to live in, and the real estate industry begins to try to steer Mexican settlement into Pilsen, what they're doing is they're trying to seize a kind of profit from this migration and settlement. Eventually, the city takes a new interest in this community by the 1960s and 70s, and in fact, City Hall and the Department of Urban Renewal begins to create what are called market analysis studies. And you should, if you're interested in urban history, and if you're interested in San Antonio, for instance, I would encourage you to look into some of these market analysis studies that were created by city halls almost everywhere. Usually, they were created in communities of color or marginalized communities. The one I'm talking about was created in 1969 by the Department of Urban Renewal. And the kind of study that I'm talking about really tried to forecast what this neighborhood could be valued at if it didn't have the kind of working class communities that it has. In other words, it's trying to imagine tax producing real estate that is favorable to the city, that they can then invite not the federal bulldozer, but private investors to buy up buildings and invest in this community to really improve the neighborhood. And I use the word improve in quotation marks because really what they're talking about is a form of gentrification, although that word was not necessarily in the market studies themselves. The community eventually, uh, the Mexican community in Pilsen eventually discovers these market analysis studies. And one of the people that really profits off of this study is a man by the name of John Podmazierski, pictured here in this article called The Colonization of Pilsen, written in 1978. Podmazierski was somebody that used to work for the Department of Urban Renewal. And he uses that data to then buy up buildings in Mexican Pilsen to try to create what he called an artist colony, a neighborhood of painters and artists that were not the kind of artists that the Chicano movement was producing, but essentially white artist is what Padre Majersky is promoting here. And he becomes, as you can imagine, a very unliked figure in Pilsen in the 1970s. He's not the only person that is essentially, quote, colonizing Pilsen, but he is one of many investors that in the 1970s and 1980s begin to buy up hundreds of cheaply cheaply priced buildings to move out Mexican residents and to move in what they would deem more desirable people. And this was something that was not unlawful. This was something that was quite legal. Um, and eventually it created a catalyst for the community control movement in Pilsen. Um, a group by the name of the Pilsen Neighbors begins to organize against Padre Majersky, and really they begin to develop a critique of this kind of investment that's happening in Pilsen. The artists themselves that Padre Majersky helps out come to his defense. One artist by the name of Barbara Aubin tells a local newspaper in 1980, Padre Majersky had a vision. He felt artists in the city needed both breathing space, and so he built this beautiful community for us. Um, this was a different statement than Mexican residents who who also took to the press, like Teresa Fraga, a community leader in the Pilsen Neighbors movement. Teresa told the press, "This is a man who does not rent to Mexican families. He doesn't like us. He doesn't want families living in his buildings." And so the kind of community action that Pilsen Neighbors mobilizes in the aftermath of this investment or this gentrification is essentially to try to buy buildings and develop them themselves. This creates a bonanza of local community organizations that try to control the real estate of Pilsen. And one of the actions that members of these organizations do is to rent school buses and fill them with neighborhood people and drive out to the suburbs, because a lot of the building owners in Pilsen were absentee landlords, people that owned a lot of property in Pilsen but lived in the suburbs. They never came to the community. They just collected the rents from residents. Um, and so the community organizations rent these buses and they drive them out to the suburbs to protest in front of people's large suburban homes and to shame them for being deadbeat slumlords and landlords that were neglectful of not only predominantly Mexican renters, but also selling their buildings to folks like Podmajersky. This was uh, Teresa Fraga's family here and in their building. And this is obviously a very large, beautiful family that Teresa Fraga has, but the kind of families that many of the new investors did not want. They didn't want large families. And Pilsen in the 1970s and 1980s was a neighborhood of large families. I want to show you another slide just to kind of close. Eventually, Chicago and City Hall and its private investors create something called Chicago 21. This is a master plan to remake communities like Pilsen. Again, following the studies that I just talked about earlier, the market analysis studies. And so Pilsen residents are alarmed by this and organize against this. This flyer is one of those flyers that was distributed in the neighborhoods, and it said, "Atención, familias de Pilsen. Big business wants to move in on our neighborhood." And let me see if I could find. This is one of the renderings developed by some of the private investors working with City Hall. And in this rendering, this is Pilsen essentially, but this is Pilsen imagined as a riverfront community in which you could, be a white collar worker that works in downtown Chicago, and on the weekends you could, use your boat to just kind of frolic around the Pilsen River and walk around this riverfront community and perhaps live in one of the condos that was proposed in this plan. And these were the proposed plans that eventually the community gets its hands on and begins to organize to try to stop, which they're successful and they actually do defeat the master plan. But this master plan is something that has, over the last 30 years, crept up in different iterations. And as I mentioned at the outset, Pilsen is a community that remains a Mexican community. It remains a sanctuary to Mexican immigrant workers and Mexican American families, but is also under siege by private investors, by venture capitalists, and is indeed arguably, one can say, losing that fight. This, just to leave you with a final image. This is an image of an immigrant rights march in 1996 in Pilsen. Pilsen, since the 1960s, has been at the forefront of fighting not only for the kind of spatial sense of belonging, but also the national sense of belonging. They've been fighting for immigrant rights at the local, national, and transnational scales. And this image in particular is very profound for me because if you fast forward 10 years later to 2006, and don't take my word for it, simply do a Google search for pro-immigrant marches Chicago 2006, you will see uh, uh, tens of thousands of people marching in the streets of downtown Chicago for immigrant rights. But 10 years earlier, you were already seeing that small trickle of residents that were already organizing along those lines. And so this image is very unique and very special to me because it shows that fight. Esta es mi tierra, esta es mi lucha. And again, Pilsen continuing the fight for a sanctuary in the city of Chicago. So I'll stop there and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Thank you so much.
Wow, you covered a lot there. I do have some questions for you. Okay. Um, you mentioned that one of the, I don't know, one of the things that this slum renewal was doing was that it was allowing officials to control that demographic diversity in the wake of both the first Great Migration and then the second Great Migration of African Americans to Chicago. Um, I think we also often think of Chicago as being, well, you mentioned the Czechs and the Polish. I think of Chicago as being very much a kind of a migrant or immigrant city, not unlike a New York or something like that. And so we've got this Mexican American population, and then of course we've also got a lot of Puerto Ricans in Chicago. So I was just wondering if you could talk about, you mentioned a little bit about the pushback that Mexican settlers in Pilsen had from the Czech and the Polish, but what is the dynamic with the Mexican Americans, African Americans, Puerto Ricanos?
That's a great question, Sarah. Thank you. So yes, we think of Chicago as indeed a very immigrant city. It has been an immigrant city since really the early uh, 18th century, or arguably the late 17th century. But I think what ends up happening in the 20th century is that despite the segregation, there are neighborhoods like the Near West Side that remain because of the substandard housing that they have, because of the industry that they're close to, they remain the kind of magnet communities, the anchor communities for the more recent arrival of migrants, whether they be from Clarksdale, Mississippi, or Michoacan, or Jalisco, or San Juan, Puerto Rico, right? And so, in a very unique way, the Near West Side did have a kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial dynamic that was quite unlike other communities in Chicago. Now, you mentioned the Czechs and the Polish. By the 1940s and 50s, given that these migrations from Eastern Europe happened a lot earlier in the 19th century, um, these would have been folks that, while they maintained their Polish and Eastern European identity, are by all purposes considered ethnic white working class people in Chicago. And this would have been a constituency that had some political clout with City Hall, and therefore the city would have had a hard time convincing Polish Americans that their community ought to be a site for urban renewal. And in fact, very rarely did they become places for slum clearance. And the moments in which, and they were few, the moments in which the city did turn to ethnic white neighborhoods to offer up a plan for urban renewal, they rejected and organized against those plans. And so the city selected areas they knew did not have as much political clout as ethnic white areas had. And so when the mayor and when the city council was taking up federal urban renewal dollars, they're primarily looking at Black and brown neighborhoods in Chicago to exert that money and shape those communities.
Okay. Um, these days we're told that Chicagoland and I guess Cook County is the third largest Mexican American population in the United States. So I guess part one of that is, when did that happen? And part two is, does that mean that Mexican Americans in Chicago have political power?
Those are very good questions, and I would argue they can be quite loaded questions
Okay.
because, well, yes. Let me get to the population question. Chicago does become eventually the third largest metropolitan area in the United States, after Los Angeles, after well, I shouldn't say Los Angeles, but really Southern California, and then of course places in Texas like San Antonio and its regions around San Antonio. For Chicago, this really is a story about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. The 1990s being a decade of perhaps the peaks of the highest Mexican immigration and arrival to Cook County. And even though my book is roughly about the southwest side of the city, in the 2020s, you can find, of course, Latinos and Mexican people in every corner of Cook County. They live in the surrounding suburbs. They live in the most outer rings of the city. They live in downtown. They live in Pilsen. They live in these historic Mexican neighborhoods. But do they have political power? That is a good question. Let me just kind of backtrack a little bit. I talked about the Chicana and Chicano movements of the 1960s and 70s and the community control movements. These things happened in other Latino cities too, as you know. They happened in Los Angeles, they happened in San Antonio, they happened in San Francisco. And in those cities, you had one of the outcomes of these movements was electoral power, leaders that were elected. You know, when I visit El Paso, I'm struck by the Latino names that are on city buildings and libraries because these are wonderful things. They're named after elected officials from these decades. Chicago didn't quite get that at that time, meaning that despite having these social movements, they didn't manifest into electoral power in the 1970s. And it took really up until the mid 1980s in the context of the Harold Washington mayoral campaign, 1983, to really build a kind of coalition that would eventually elect Latino city council people in Chicago politics. Um, and so that's a really complicated story, but I think what it says is that Chicago has been kind of slower than most Latino majority cities to really manifest into kind of electoral political power. Now, today, Chicago does have Latino city council members, very vocal ones. It has members of the DSA, of the Democratic Socialists of America. It also has people that are more aligned with status quo machine style politics. Um, uh, the question still does remain how much political clout Latino residents have in the city of Chicago. I think that gerrymandering is part of a factor in this story, and certainly the differing views within the Latino community, as we learned in the presidential elections. We don't all vote the same, right? And so uh, Chicagoans also are unique in that way. But yes, excellent questions that we should keep asking and trying to answer for sure.
Okay. And then just one last thing to close. You showed us an image earlier of a mural in Pilsen. I've been hearing a lot of controversy coming out of Pilsen about murals being painted over as the neighborhood's being gentrified and people in the neighborhood feeling very uncomfortable about changes that are happening there. Um, this is like a brand new wave, right? Um, is that mural that you showed us still there? And do you care to speculate on, is Pilsen going to remain the Mexicano neighborhood or not?
So my understanding is that that mural is no longer there, sadly, and that that building was purchased, I believe, by an investment group. That building is no longer Casa Aslan. I believe it's being converted into condos, and that the murals themselves have been whitewashed. Although um, this is, I think the last time I walked on Racine Street there was maybe like a year ago. So I don't know what it currently looks like today. But, uh, yes, your question about will Pilsen remain a Mexicano neighborhood? I think there's a lot of community organizations working against gentrification right now in that community that are very concerned about that, and are trying to do everything in their power to really uh, attack, organize against the kind of faceless investment that's happening, because some of the venture capitalists that are buying properties, uh, they're hard to find. It's hard to find who they are. You know what I mean? In the 1970s, organizations working to discover who owned buildings, it was a little bit easier. This was public record, and activists taught themselves how to go to City Hall and find out who owned this building, which slumlord do we have to go and shame and protest against. That's much more difficult in the 2020s, and today you can walk down 18th Street and you can see things that are not associated with anything having to do with Latinos or Mexicanos. There's a ramen shop, there's pour over coffee, there are no panaderias, or maybe there are a few, but certainly not the amount that existed there in the 1980s and 90s. And in many ways, yeah, I think that the future of the community is in question, at whether that community will be an affordable working class Mexicano community. But I think that this is a question that has been asked for roughly 45 plus years now. This is a question that activists asked as soon as they learned about the market analysis study in the early 1970s. And so there will probably be new solutions that I'm probably not as smart enough to know what those solutions are. I think about the past, not the future too much, but hopefully we can make that community an equitable community for working class people looking forward in the future, for sure.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Mike. I want to thank you for presenting that tonight. I think we all learned a lot about Chicago, and probably were able to just recognize some patterns in our own urban environments. So thank you, Mike, and thank you to everybody who tuned in tonight to catch tonight's talk. If you did miss part of tonight's talk, or if you want to share it with others, this video will remain available on our Facebook and YouTube pages for future viewing. I also hope that you will join us again in 2 weeks, when we will be having a virtual talk titled Revisiting the 2019 Latino Equity Complaint Against the University of Texas at Austin, which will provide us with an update on a 2019 study that found widespread disparities for Latino faculty at Texas's flagship university. And if you liked tonight's presentation, I encourage you to learn more about MACRI and how you can support our vision for a national center dedicated to preserving and disseminating Mexican American civil rights history by visiting our website at somosmacri.org. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.